introduce today's virtual lunch and learn session, which, as you can see, is on the dietary guidelines and recommendations to how to implement those in an effective way. And I am also going to introduce our speaker, Noel Anderson from Mosaic Food Advisors. If you go to the next slide. NCFAR, the National Coalition for Food and Agricultural Research, is as it sounds. It's a coalition of organizations that are involved across the whole food supply chain, from farm to fork, and come together to provide a unified voice to advocate for appropriate investments and really to do everything we can to improve the diet and health of the United States, of our population. The next slide, please. Today, we're going to be talking about the dietary guidelines and helping the Americans meet these. And it could not be a more appropriate topic. I think everybody is well aware that later this month we have the first or the second White House conference in history on health hunger, over 50 years from the last one. And it comes just after the latest dietary guidelines were introduced last year. And as Noel will eloquently tell you, we've made great progress over the last 40 years in refining our dietary guidelines, but the country has not made great progress in the health of the country. And again, I couldn't think of a more critical topic for us to talk about. As I mentioned, I'm the Chief Science and Technology Officer, IFT, Institute of Food Technologists. The Institute of Food Technologists is a global organization with over 12,000 members from government, industry, academia, who come together to really advance the science of food and do everything we can to solve the help solve the major problems around the world, but in particular here in the United States, around diet, hunger, and health. So it's very appropriate that we volunteer to sort of help put today's session together. And Noel Anderson, who I have known for over 40 years, I first met Noel when we worked together in the former General Foods, one of the old powerhouses of the food industry for many, many years, subsequently through Kraft, and most recently have known him in his role as the president of IFT. So I work with Noel a lot. I worked for Noel recently when he was the president of IFT. He's now just the immediate past president. He has his own partner companies, a part of a company that he's formed to really help startups in this area. But Noel's been engaged in the world of food for almost as long as I have, although he'll tell you maybe that longer because he claims he was born into a family of food scientists. I know he was, so I'm joking. He's got incredibly depth and breadth of scientific knowledge from his food industry experience, from his academic experience. He's a proud alumni of UMass, where he continued to serve on the industry advisory board, I think, and chaired it for many years and worked very diligently. He's a passionate advocate of partnerships, whether it be between academic and industry or government. I can't think of anybody better to talk about this subject today. So with that, Noel, I will pass it to you.
Oh, thank you so much, John. That was quite the introduction. You're making me blush with all those nice words you had to say about me. But it is a pleasure to be here, to have this opportunity to speak to all of you. And as John mentioned, this is an area that's always been a key passion to me. I grew up in the science of food. My dad was a professor at UMass when I was born, and I learned an awful lot from him and his exploits during his career in the science of food. I spent 37 years in industry, General Foods, Kraft, then PepsiCo. So I learned a lot during that career, and most of the work, as you'll hear in subsequent slides, had to do with health and wellness initiatives. So again, pleasure to be here. So there's three things I'm going to cover today. One is to review briefly the history of the dietary guidelines and a little bit about food science, and talk some about what has worked well, but also what hasn't worked so well. I do want to review some of the outputs of a joint meeting that IFT had with the Department of Food Science at the University of Massachusetts, which the theme of that was, how do we kickstart healthy eating? And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the urgent need for funding for basic food research. And as I go through these slides, you'll learn a few new things. Certainly, I learned some new things preparing for this presentation, but I also hope that you'll start to develop some questions. And I think having good questions is the first step to really making progress on any project or solving any problems. And finally, I hope to generate with all of you a call to action, a sense of urgency to do something about what we're talking about, because as John already mentioned, we haven't made much progress in terms of complying against really sound dietary guidelines when it comes to consumption. So just a very brief overview. I always like to provide a wider context before I talk about the time frame that we're going to be really zeroing in, which is the last 40 years. But overall, our food supply has changed dramatically over the last 100 years in particular. What I always appreciate is that these are not new technologies that have been developed to help provide safe and stable foods to consumers. There's been a lot of work over generations. But to me, some of the key points in history that were pertinent to today's conversation is, number one, the Industrial Revolution. Many of the food companies that we know of today started during that time. They're one of the first to modernize production of food so they can make it much more cheaply and affordable to the consumer. And as they developed their supply chains, they could get products to consumers on a very broad basis and provide them the type of good, nutritious foods that they were looking for. As we merged into the 20th century, that's when we started to become much more scientific. So in 1908, or 1906, the FDA was formed to make sure that we were working on and complying to a safe food supply. In 1918, the first food science department was created in the United States at University of Massachusetts. And this was really an outcome of the food shortages that existed during World War I. They needed to figure out and apply science to figure out better ways to provide nutritious, preserved foods to the consumers to address some of the shortages that existed after World War I. I'll talk about some of these other points in a little while. But again, there's been lots of progress to make sure we can provide safe, nutritious, affordable foods to the consumers, particularly over the past 100 years. So as all that scientific understanding evolved, so has the food applications. So large companies like Kellogg's, Kraft, Heinz, General Mills, General Foods, they were created during this time frame and really flourished because of a few different major things. Number one, they were able to produce safe products so the consumers could trust that they wouldn't get sick eating these foods. They were stable, so you can make these products, distribute them through the supply chain. Consumers could store them and use them when they need them. Obviously, they had to be legal at that point in time. With the Industrial Revolution, they could produce these products at scale, which allowed them to price them at a very affordable cost to the consumers. Again, through the supply chain, they were very accessible to the consumers, and through efforts on processing and packaging, they could make them very convenient to use. And it was during this time frame, during the late 1900s, where it really became a consumer-centric business. Taste became king. Those companies that could do all of those things that I just listed, but deliver the products that consumers would love, and then buy once, buy again, buy a third time. That's what really led to consumer success. And the consumers really became the decision makers, and they voted with their pocketbooks about which companies were going to flourish and which would not. Again, over the last 100 years, early advances in nutrition led to shift from basic survival to address nutrient deficiencies. So in the 1920s, iodine and salt, vitamin D for rickets were implemented as fortification to solve very targeted problems. Later in the 1900s, vitamin C and folate were added to the food supply. These initiatives were very, very successful because, number one, you had a clearly defined problem, whether it be goiter, scurvy, rickets, or neural tube defects. but there also was a very simplistic solution. The iodine and salt, the vitamin C, they were very, very efficacious at very low usage levels, and technologists could put these into these food products in a very stable format and use at very low levels, so they really didn't impact the organoleptic properties of the foods that these were put into. So as a result of great application of science to these problems, these issues basically went away from the American consumer. Very, very successful application of science to solve nutrient deficiencies. So as I mentioned, that first slide, the good news is that we started the dietary guidelines back in 1980. And the purpose of these guidelines was to provide science-based guidance for healthy eating to meet nutrient needs, but also to reduce the risk of developing chronic diseases. And these are also developed for health professionals and policymakers to enable the development and implementation of communication programs and policies to promote health and inform dietary planning of federal food programs, such as the National School Lunch Program and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, as well as the USDA's My Plate program. So I think everyone remembers from the dietary guidelines, the type of things that are being stressed in this is to eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains, eat less red meat, consume more things like fish and legumes to get your protein, eat more fiber, and eat less sodium, saturated fats, and sugar. So that was all great news, but as John mentioned, there's been very limited improvement in diet quality. So while some of the dietary guidelines have been improved over time with future additions, such as changes in cholesterol intake recommendations and focus on dietary patterns versus nutrients, and recommendations based on life stages, the consumption of the consumer adoption of the dietary guidelines had been minimal. And this is very, very important to understand. The compliance against this is something that needs to be improved dramatically to make a difference. So during this time, industry did react to the guidance that was coming out of the dietary guidelines. So I joined General Foods in 1980. My first project was to work on a low-calorie 50-calorie low-calorie dessert treat that was utilizing a new sweetener and was portion controlled to make sure people could consume very tasty treats, but at very low caloric density. I also worked on fat mimetics, so we could use this technology to reduce fat of other food products. And at this point in time, APM was being released, aspartame, as a new high-intensity artificial sweetener to help reduce the amount of sugar in the diet. So there are a lot of things taking place in 1980 that was doing this type of work. And some of the key drivers to this were, number one, the Framingham Heart Study, which was all about cholesterol and heart disease. And what we did in industry is we started transitioning from animal fats, cholesterol, lard, tallow, and butter to move to vegetable-based fats and oils. In order to get the right type of functionality of the oils, we had to saturate the oils. That started the next wave of changes, which is to reduce saturated fats. So we then transitioned to partially hydrogenated oils, which created some technical challenges around oxidation, but also because they were chemically produced, they produced certain things such as trans fats, which later science found out were not good for you. So then there's a whole series of changes to take the trans fats out of the oils, which was done in the early 2000s, and come up with natural solutions to make fats and oils that are truly healthier for you. So lots of guidance led to lots of different changes, and the food industry did successfully produce great tasting products that went through all of these changes. A very similar story was told for sugars, and I have another slide on that in a second. But really the history in the sugar area was we started off with high intensity artificial sweeteners in the 80s. In the 90s and 2000s, we went to natural high-intensity sweeteners and also developed sweet quality tools to help make those high-intensity sweeteners taste better in the products. And a similar story could be told for salt. And I'm not going to get into that today, but lots and lots of effort by all the major players in industry to address the guidance given to them. So as an example, the type of sweeteners we work with saccharin, APM, sucralose, and ACE-K, and you can see the dates they were implemented. And I think the key part of this story is whether they're artificial or natural, they're very highly intense, so you don't have to use very much of them. Because you don't have to use very much of them, they're not delivering a very high caloric load in the product. So the hypothesis was that as long as these products taste sweet, you can take out the sugar and it'll perform very well. Also, all of this work on artificial sweeteners and natural sweeteners had led to something I saw in the news wires just last week. The estimation is that the global high-intensity sweetener market will reach $4.2 billion by 2029. So this seems really good, right? You know, great success, able to take a lot of sugar out of products, come up with diet products, et cetera, et cetera. As a result of all those technologies, like I said, industry adapted to the guidance and they grew very successfully. So PepsiCo started with your fun for you products down in the bottom of the slide, the sugar-laden soft drinks, the fatty, high salt chips and things like that. But they started to reduce the negatives and came out with the better for you products, which are the baked Lays, reduced calorie soft drinks, Life Water, things like that. Those grew very successfully. And then they started to develop their good for you portfolio, such as Tropicana juices, Quaker Oat cereals, and things like that. Unilever and Nestle and others did the same type of thing. So Unilever came up with a sustainable living plan and 61% of their portfolio met the highest nutritional standards by 2020. So again, it seems like great progress. But, and this is what John alluded to before, it's been 42 years since 1980, the consumer health does not seem to be improving. So from 2005 to 16, the average healthy eating index score of the US only increased from 56 to 59. So I don't know if that's statistically significant or not, but it's not much of an improvement. And it falls so far short of 100, which would indicate full adherence to the recommendations. And at the same time, as you all know, diet-related chronic diseases have increased: obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, et cetera. It now impacts over 60% of US adults, and it's costing the US healthcare system billions of dollars every year. So this is one of my favorite slides that I used throughout my career at General Foods, Kraft, and PepsiCo. And it's really from our friend Albert Einstein, and suggests that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. So as I indicated previously, I spent 37 years, General Foods, Kraft, and PepsiCo, working on these type of initiatives. I feel really bad that they don't seem to have made a difference when it comes to things like reducing salt, sugar, and fat. So I don't think that we have accurately defined the problem that we're all facing. So along those lines, IFT and the Department of Food Science at UMass convened some experts to really talk about what do we need to do and is it time to kickstart healthy eating. So this meeting was held in May of 2021 with the objective of discussing opportunities and strategies for improved implementation and greater consumer adoption of the guidelines. And the approach was to have a 2-day series of presentations and panel discussions on May 4th and 5th, which were open to the public, followed by a roundtable discussion on May 11th with 35 invited participants focused on 3 themes. Number 1, look at the consumer trends, attitudes, and motivations towards diet and health? Second, what is the role of science and technology innovations to help improve the adoption of the guidelines? And finally, what can we do to improve effective communication and building trust with the consumers? So I think this is a great effort, much like today's meeting today, to get people together and talk about these challenges. We need to do more of these type of things. So the first recommendation that came out of these series of meetings is, number one, is can we leverage the positive changes affected by COVID-19 and with greater focus on health and prevalence of home cooking? So I think we all learned a lot from COVID-19, and some of the things that we went through in this meeting are the following. Number one, consumers, I think, learned that it's very high risk for individuals with chronic conditions. Consumers sought foods with purported immune boosting properties. There was an increased purchase of shelf-stable foods. There was more cooking at home, and it's the first time in the last 30 years where 55% of the purchases were, or of occasions, were at home versus in the restaurants and offsite. People tended to buy branded products because the trust. CPG growth is up 12% during this period. And interestingly enough, there was a huge increase in trial of new products. 4 in 10 consumers tried new products. So throughout this COVID period of time, there were some interesting trends taking place. And what these teams came up with is the following 3 things. Is number one, emphasize the health benefits and other motivating values, such as increased family time gained through cooking at home. This is a good thing. Food is about socialization, getting families together. Second one was to demonstrate the ease of incorporating healthy foods and ingredients from multiple types of processing into home-cooked meals. And the third recommendation was to empower consumers with cooking skills and methods to prepare a variety of foods that can be part of a healthy dietary pattern. So that was the first set. The second set of recommendations were about continuing to promote a healthy, affordable, accessible, and consumer acceptable food supply. So what can we do to further advance food science technology to expand the food supply while increasing affordability? Second is to leverage current interest in science to debunk some of the myths that are out there about food processing, ultra-processed foods, things like that, and demonstrate, like I tried to do on that very first slide, the similarity of techniques used at home to those used at scale in the food industry. There's very little that we've done in the food industry that can't be directly related to a process that used in a home to prepare products. So the tagline to this is food processing can contribute to the solution of the challenges that we face. And the third part was to destigmatize food categories such as canned and frozen foods. These are very healthy sources of nutrition, and study after study have shown that they actually have improved nutritional qualities versus many of the fresh products available in the marketplace, depending on how old those products are when you purchase them and finally prepare them. The third set of recommendations around broadening collaborations and partners across the entire food sector, much like we're talking about today. Number one, to unify and amplify the messages of the dietary guidelines, to advocate for more public-private partnerships and investment, to again, move those dietary patterns closer to the recommendations. I love this one, which is about providing more education, particularly for healthcare professionals and primary care physicians, and require nutrition and health promotion training and offering for continuing education for practitioners. Partner with retailers to amplify the messages in stores. And finally, to learn from the challenges and successful implementation of the dietary guidelines with large populations, et cetera. And finally, the fourth set of recommendations are all about effective communication to build trust. At the end of the day, consumers make decisions based on trust. That's why they trended towards the well-known brands to purchase during COVID. So what we're suggesting is to move away from traditional communication approaches that focus on education to strategies that meet consumers where they are to affect small changes in diet that can add up over time. To develop simple, targeted, consistent messages for different demographics, age, race, culture, etc. To employ a diverse set of communication platforms commonly used by the targeted industry, whether it be Snapchat or whatever, and engage in influencers and spokespersons that the target consumers relate to and trust. So these are all great recommendations, but I would ask the question, are we missing anything? So I'll go back to my Einstein slide. Have we done a great job of defining holistic success? And as he is often quoted, if he had an hour, he'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem, 5 minutes trying to solve it. I would suggest that great taste, convenience, and good value are no longer good enough. We need to deliver authentic health and wellness benefits going forward. And to do this, more research is needed. And new research and skill sets stretching beyond the traditional food science disciplines, nutrition disciplines, are needed to help successfully address these challenges. So switching gears for a minute, back in 2020, IFT created a call to action on funding and priorities. And I'm going to go through the highlights of that. And the first message from this is that agri-food, so agriculture and food industry, is the third largest direct contributor to the US GDP after healthcare and housing. So in 2018, agri-food contributed $5 trillion of combined GDP, accounting for almost 23 million jobs, with the food industry contributing about 21 million of those jobs, delivering $137 billion of exports, and food is a net exporter while agriculture is a net importer. So we are a big part of what makes this country tick. But funding of agri-food research has been very low. So when I first saw this slide, I was pretty upset. Realized it only goes till 2013, but you can see the US in blue is around $4 billion. That's well below what Western Europe typically invests. And you notice that curve going way up is China. China is dramatically outspending the US in terms of research on agriculture and food. And the trend even got worse in 2014. Furthermore, for the USDA grants of $1.51 billion, only 37% goes to agriculture and only 4% goes to food science and technology research. Very, very small amount. And even with FFAR, only 4.5% of their budget goes to food research. The interesting thing I found, since I'm obviously involved with IFT, is that when you look at publications in our own Journal of Food Science, in 2021, 49% of the authors were from China. 6% were from India. Only 5.9% were from the US, followed by Brazil at 4.8% and Iran at 3.8%. So again, other indications that we are falling way behind in terms of generating research on food and the ingredients and things like that. I just find that amazing how far we've fallen in that area. And food science and technology plays a major role in the value chain. So agriculture is the genetics of animals, plants, et cetera, and farming and post-harvest. Food science and technology takes those products, turns them into ingredients, makes new food products, processes and packages them, manufactures, ships them to the consumer through retail, and at the end of the day, make products that consumers experience, purchase, buy, and hopefully buy again. And that's where you start to get compliance if they love your products and buy them again. So food science and technology has a huge role, tremendously underfunded, to help develop new understanding of what we can do to make things better. So the call to action from IFT was that we need a paradigm shift in public-private and public-private investments. We need more research to unlock scientific and technology solutions and build a robust pipeline. And the original slide I had here was maintain our global competitiveness. I'd say we need to regain or rebuild our global competitiveness. We are falling woefully behind. And so we'd love to urge all federal agencies beyond the USDA to invest and prioritize research in food and agriculture. So to me, this is a dramatic call to action that needs all of our attention. So again, the IFT created a food and nutrition steering committee with a group of global food science experts, and they really looked to where across that value chain we could make a difference. And it's very broad what we can do in terms of reducing food waste, improve environmental sustainability, improve post-harvest preservation and processing to improve nutrient retention, new processing technologies that can utilize less water, energy, and improve nutrient retention, new alternative proteins, whether they come in from insects, from fungi, cell culture, or whatever. So there's an awful lot of things that we can do to help move the needle in this space. But I would suggest there's even more we need to be thinking about. So let's go back to health and wellness and human sustainability. I think I laid out a pretty compelling story that industry followed the guidance, but removing the negatives, salt, sugar, and fat, doesn't seem to have helped. So if that hasn't helped, then what is healthy eating? How do you measure it? And moreover, what happens after you consume the product in our gut and in our bodies? What are we missing? What do we not know? So an example, let's talk about sugar reduction. And the slide on the right is a model of our human gut. The original hypothesis is that with all those artificial, natural, high-intensity sweeteners, they only need to taste very sweet and not provide calories. So that's what we worked against. Much work was done with taste receptors to find these high-intensity sweeteners and enhancers. This was very successful. Lots of new sweeteners were created. But the question that wasn't answered is what happens after it passes your tongue and gets into your body? How does your microbiome react to these new compounds? And interestingly enough, during this research I was involved with, we found out and wondered, why do we have sweet receptors in our gut, in our brain, and in our heart muscle? Why do we have these? What role do they play? We don't know. A very recent study indicates that sugar substitutes are not inert. They actually affect the microbiome, which in turn can affect our glycemic response. This is, again, just 2022 data. So there was a study done in 2014 with mice showing that non-nutritive sweeteners can impact glucose tolerance in mice. And that was replicated this year in humans. And they do show that the gut microbes are responsive to the sweeteners, of particularly saccharin and sucralose. And they change the microbiome composition, and that is highly correlated with the alteration in the people's glycemic responses. They took microbial samples from these people and injected them into mice, and the recipient mice developed similar glycemic alterations. So this clearly indicates there's more going on to high-intensity sweeteners that we previously know, and more research is needed. Similarly, work done by Dana Small at Yale and the Monell Chemical Sciences Institute in Philadelphia suggests that there's also a different feedback loop where receptors in the gut go directly to the brain and impact this whole system, if you will. A second recent finding, cravings for fatty foods traced again to the gut-brain connection. Mouse research reveals fat sensors in the intestines that stimulate the brain and drive food desires. So the key thing here, and I love the way this person described this, is our focus in the past for food scientists has been what goes into the body. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? How does it taste on the tongue? So the brain tells our tongue tells our brain what we like, but it's really the gut that tells us what we need. Again, more research needed to fully understand how we take that knowledge, further understand it so we can better formulate foods that will have the right intended impact on the consumer. And there's more. What about high fiber? That's been shown to change the human gut microbiome. Along with fiber, there's a lot of other compounds that come along with the dietary fiber, such as the flavonoids. And again, some research suggests that flavonoids can fend off forgetfulness. And another article about prescribing fruits and veggies would save $100 billion a year in medical costs. So a lot of interesting research suggesting there's a lot we don't know about how to drive superior nutrition to the average consumer. So looking ahead, I think a big part of the solution will come from new places. So being in the startup space for the last 6 years, I've been exposed to a lot of these type of things. And what's interesting about the startup space is that really working at the confluence of sustainability and nutrition and creating new food business models, utilizing technology at its core. So lots of money going into this space. And I'm sure you're all aware of products like Impossible, Beyond Meat, and maybe you don't know about New Way Foods, but that's a plant-based shrimp. So lots of activities to make plant-based food products and lots of activity to use cell culture rather than plant-based proteins to create these new sources of protein-based foods. So I think all of this work is great and exciting, but the key questions I have is, number one, will they deliver on taste? And I think you've seen a little bit of a back off, particularly for Beyond Meat and a little bit on Impossible. The products aren't doing quite as well in the marketplace as they were a year or so ago. Still unclear how much sustainability they really do deliver versus their natural competitors. But the question I have is health and wellness. So these products are plant-based, so you'd assume that you're getting plant nutrition, but most of these products are really just made with plant-based proteins. They're not going to have the fiber, the flavonoids, all those phytonutrients that are essential to deliver plant-based nutrition. So I think more research is needed to understand whether they're really going to deliver true health and wellness benefits versus traditional meats and seafood. I also believe with these challenges, there'll be new opportunities. I think if you're looking for major impact, the current industrial system has a proven ability to make great tasting, affordable, and accessible products while resolving key nutritional issues like they did for reducing sugar, salt, and fat. What I find really interesting is they have tremendous reach. So if you want to have a big impact, if you can get these players engaged and create the right products, PepsiCo, for instance, back in 2016, would deliver 1.3 billion servings of products a day to the consumers. So just think the type of reach that PepsiCo, Mondelez, Nestle, Unilever could have if, again, their portfolio had products that really delivered the intended impact for health and wellness. In order to do that, we need to have better scientifically validated guidance. I think there's so much more we need to know about what really delivers health and wellness benefits and defines healthy eating. And much more basic research funding is needed to create the guidance that will make a difference. So I think we can get there, but we need more research and guidance to help us get there. So in closing, I'm a firm believer that crises create great opportunities. I saw that at IFT when COVID hit and we had to go virtual and really reinvent how we worked at IFT and how we delivered our annual meetings. And I think the same thing goes for the food industry. We have an increased need for safe, nutritious, sustainable, and affordable food for all. but the consumers need to embrace these products, need to love them, buy them again to get compliance against the guidelines. Sound evidence, but science will be the key, but funding is needed. We're woefully underfunded from my perspective. It's not going to be just the food scientists. We need many other disciplines involved in this effort to help clarify, define, and solve the problems. We need all of you to take action, to lead, to advocate, support research, etc. And food scientists need to be part of this process. They need to be engaged because nobody knows better how to formulate, process, package products, preserve nutrition, deliver those right compounds to the right part of the gut in the human body than the food scientists. So I'm an optimist. I think together, having meetings like this, getting people talking about these type of issues, creating more understanding, more engagement, asking more questions is key to success. And I think together we can bring the world food that truly does make a difference and helps address the obesity, the diabetes challenges that we all face. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share something I'm very passionate about. I hope that you've learned a few things. I hope that you've developed a lot of questions in your mind. And like I said at the beginning, I hope many of you will take action on some of these things that I've talked about. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you so much. That really covered the waterfront in a major way, and I encourage folks to put their questions in. There was one earlier that was answered by Ana Rosales, who's our Senior Director of Nutrition at IFT, which was about whether the numbers you were quoting on public spending were solely US federal or take into account private industry, and Anna's already responded that all those numbers were public funding. But no, you might just want to comment and add some color to that about the nature of industry funding, because I think there's perhaps a lack of understanding often about where industry's research funding goes, and and the critical importance of the sort of the public funding to sort of be the basis of their work.
Yeah, so when I first joined General Foods back in 1980,
I think you're on mute now.
I'm sorry?
We hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. When I started in General Foods back in 1980, it was very common for industry.
Mute.
So John can't hear me, Anna or Sarah.
One
Can everyone
second.
else hear me?
We can hear you.
I'm sorry. It must have been. I apologize. No, apologize to everybody else too.
Yeah. So there's been a major change in industry around funding, particularly when it comes to basic research. Back in the 1980s, all of the major food players had their own basic research groups that provided insights and created knowledge about how to develop products going forward. Come the 1990s, 2000s, that basic research went away. So most of industry does applied research. That means the basic research has to come from someplace else, primarily from the universities. And that's the area where it has not grown at all. If anything, it's down from where it was in the 1990s and early 2000s. So the basic research on food and the microbiome and all those type of things I talked about is what is sorely needed. I think industry can then take that knowledge and apply it to make products that better deliver against what the objectives are.
That's great. Yeah, no, I totally agree there. Question about cost. We often hear today consumers say they can't afford to eat healthy, and it's certainly true that you can eat some relatively bad nutritional foods very cheaply, and it can often be harder to find them more expensive. What can we do to make healthy foods more affordable?
So that's as you know, John, that's a really tough question, but
I gave you the softball one to start with.
Yeah. But again, I think it gets back to what I indicated in the presentation. Industry still needs to develop products that the consumers will love, but it has to deliver against the real promises of delivering against health and wellness. So I think we need to hold industry to a higher standard, talk about this, but I think the guidance that the basic research gives them and government can support is going to be the key. I think that it's all about the scientific understanding of what happens in the gut, in your bodies, that we woefully lack understanding of. Once we learn that, we can make the association with improved health. And I think industry will be able to make them affordable and great tasting.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Sort of on a different tack, I mean, you talked a lot earlier about the dietary guidelines and how, you know, they in themselves do not appear to have done what we all wish they'd have done. Any thoughts on what we could do better, you know, within the next round of the dietary guidelines? And maybe just to extend that question from my perspective, you know, with the upcoming White House conference, thoughts there about what we can do to really sort of crack this issue and change behavior and get a better get the U.S. In a healthier state.
So the first thing that comes to mind is trust. And one of the things I talked about at IFT was around COVID. And I was really hoping that with the great technology of mRNA vaccines, that people would start to build much more trust in great science, that it really deliver great benefits. So I was really hoping that trust in science would overcome some of the negative biases it seems to have. So I do think our future solutions will be depending on strong evidence-based science to deliver against this. That said, you know, I'm just amazed how many people don't accept the vaccines and don't accept sound science delivering benefits. I think we have the same challenge when it comes to these food challenges. We can talk about sound science and how it's going to make a difference for you, but it's tough to change consumer behaviors. We need other people with other disciplinary strengths to figure out, or better figure out, how we help change behavior. The simplest thing to me is if we can really make better for you products, truly better for you, taste great and be similar and better tasting than the current set of products, you'll be able to transition that. But I don't know what we'd do differently today to make products that are truly different from a health and wellness performance point of view. I think that's the missing thing from my point of view.
Okay, and I mean, sort of maybe building on that, I certainly was smiling because, yes, I think you and I have both experienced that and spent a lot of time trying to sort of achieve that and trying to get the understanding of science. In that relationship, you know, any thoughts on how we could help educate, you know, the broader audience of, or the broader scientific communities of, you know, the nutrition, public health, others within the across the whole food chain on the critical importance of food science and within our sort of dietary process.
Yeah, and I think the recommendations coming out from the IFT UMass Food Science meeting were right on in terms of the direction of what needs to happen. It's how do you build trust? Can you find spokespeople that consumers trust? Can you communicate in the ways that people are used to communicating in today's world? How do you do that? But again, it gets down to building trust. People only listen to people they trust. And I think that's something I don't have the solve for. And hopefully we have other people with other disciplines can have better ways to do it. I would suggest, I really like the approach IFT took back in 2015 and 16, where they're trying to educate about food science to the consumer by doing a movie called Food Evolution. And the approach was to use very, renowned filmmakers to produce a film to get people to talk about science, in this case, GMOs, and how to have a dialogue about what the challenges are in terms of accepting science to help make positive differences. So utilizing professionals with the right expertise to communicate to consumers, I think, is a critical thing that needs to be leveraged going forward, whether it be filmmakers or Alan Alda or other famous personalities that have some credibility with consumers.
There's a couple more questions, but I continue to encourage anybody who wants to ask one. I think we've still got sort of 8 or 9 minutes available. Sort of one of the comments, it's less a question, but you may want to add something there is, a comment from it may be helpful to reinvest in education at the secondary school level, teaching school-age children how to food, shop, cook, budget, all the skills for independent living. The comment is it's currently not a high priority education priority when students are choosing their classes. Any thoughts on that?
So I'm smiling because being the father of 3 daughters, I was always amazed what they'd pick up at school, bring home, and really say to my wife and I at the time, hey, mom and dad, we need to be doing this, that, or the other thing that I learned at school. It's really good to be thinking about these type of things. So I think not just intermediate and high school, but grade school, sending the right messages there to the students, they're like sponges and they will bring it home and it'll start conversations. So I think, getting the word out at a very early age and talk about healthy eating can have a powerful, powerful impact on changing how we look at things. I know we changed a lot of things, my wife and I, as a result of what we're being told by our 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids.
Yeah, I have a lot of optimism of the kind of generations that are, entering the workforce and entering family life. And, I'm always an optimist. I do believe that we'll get there, but it's a long slog. One last question here, and you've sort of touched on this, but maybe it's a chance to sort of re-stress the point. How can we encourage universities and other companies, other non-biased companies, I'm not sure what that means, to encourage in the type of research that will encourage industry leaders to make the types of changes needed? Kind of like that you could probably, I know, talk for 10 minutes on this one, but I mean,
Yeah.
just maybe what are your sort of thoughts on that? And again, it does come back to how research gets funded, I know.
Yeah, it really does get back to how research gets funded. So I guess I'd answer it in the following way. Industry only survives if they make products that consumers want, buy, and buy again and buy again. So for them to succeed into the future, and I think Indra Nooyi said it right when I was at PepsiCo, she changed the whole portfolio of PepsiCo as a company by investing in products and buying companies that represented the better for you food products and the good for you food products. She knew that PepsiCo wouldn't be successful if they didn't pivot back in 1998, 2000 to do that. People will move away eventually from the fried, fatty, salt-laden chips and the sugar-laden beverages. It will happen. It's a matter of time. So I think industry has a vested interest to change and truly deliver against those benefits. I think they've shown since the 1980s that they will make changes to their products based on the guidance they're given. Unfortunately, the guidance didn't pan out to any meaningful big benefits. So I think they're in it to win it, if you will, but they need to know what they need to do differently to win. And that's, I think, where the basic research comes in. So I think more conversations between industry and academia and government, like we do at IFT, are absolutely essential to get the right topics on the table and make sure that we can convince regulators that more funding is needed for academia to better figure out what is going on inside our bodies. If we understood that, then I think industry will follow along very readily to make products that taste great but do deliver.
That's probably as good a place to finish as any, Noel. I think I could tell the passion there in your thoughts. Just a
Sorry, did John freeze?
It looks like John froze just as we're wrapping up. I will finish in just saying thank you, Noel, for joining us today and for sharing your wealth and depth of knowledge on this topic. And thank you everyone else who attended. We super appreciate it. The recording will be available after. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everyone.